I'm really sorry Sarah Jaffrey couldn't make it, but we have Tim Hwang from the Infrastructure Observatory, Mathias Crawford, who's at Stanford's Department of Communication, where he teaches game design, and also Jay Springett, who does the Stacktivism Tumblr, and also was a co-designer of simple critical infrastructure maps. So Tim, you want to start?
Sure, yeah, definitely. Good morning, everybody. So happy to be here as part of Theorizing the Web. My name is Tim Hwang, and my talk today is entitled The Death and Life of Great Internet Cities. And it's over the next 15 minutes, we'll sort of cover three big things. In the first part, I'll talk a little about where I live. In the second part, I'll talk a little bit about a theory I've been working on that connects sort of the economics of the web to the structure of cities and how cities are built and how cities are planned. And then finally, I'll talk a little about where that research is going. And I'm actually super excited to be here today because it's the first time I'm sort of talking publicly about this research. And so really interested to hear kind of what you guys think about it. First, a little bit of background about me. As I mentioned, my name is Tim Hwang. I am currently an affiliate researcher at Data and Society Research Institute, which was founded by Dana Boyd, and I'm the principal investigator of the Social Architecture of Intelligent Systems project, which, in addition to being a mouthful, looks into the structure of regulations around a new wave of intelligent systems. So everything from autonomous military systems to high-frequency trading to the use of Watson for medical diagnosis. And the interest is, how do we design laws and norms to get the sorts of public interests secured in a new technological environment? Research is actually, in fact, not my background. I was the co-founder of a conference called RaffleCon, which brought together people who were momentarily internet famous to talk about internet culture, the spread of memes, and where communities are going online. That person, if you're not familiar, is Tron guy, Jay Maynard, who is mostly known for his Tron suit, but worth checking out if you have not seen that online previously. Most of what I'll be talking about today is the work of a group called the Bay Area Infrastructure Observatory, which is another four-word organization that I'm a member of. And it's basically a fan club for infrastructure. So we take tours of electrical systems, nuclear power plants, water distribution systems, that sort of thing, and in the process get put on a lot of watch lists. And we're currently working hard at work actually, on an Audubon field guide to shipping containers in the logistics industry. So that's one project that we're currently working on. So I'll jump right into it. So I live in San Francisco, which is a small city located in California, by the Bay, and is home to about 800,000 residents. And if you've been watching the news lately, San Francisco has had a really good time with journalism and with commentators that have rightly focused on a lot of the problems that the city is having. Sort of spiraling rents, increasing inequality, general sort of dickheadery in the city. And the protests that have kind of emerged in response to that. So how burrowing owls lead to vomiting anarchists was actually referenced to a real incident that happened in the city whereby a protester actually ralphed on a Google bus to protest that company's transportation policy. And so with all this coverage has also come a number of sort of experts and researchers that have tried to diagnose the problem and also suggest solutions, right? So many have pointed out that the city has a very failed housing policy. We didn't build enough housing for everybody. They've also pointed to the fact that the technology industry, by and large, has not given back to the community that it emerged in. And the presentation today is actually not to downplay any of those efforts, but I've been thinking about one idea that it's possible that the fate of San Francisco, the circumstances in which San Francisco finds itself, has less to do with the decisions of any particular one company or the decisions of any particular city or regional policy, and something maybe having to do with something actually quite deeper, something to do with actually the economics of the web as it's structured presently, and the types of businesses that have been able to thrive on that structure. And I think this is actually particularly important to look at this point in time, particularly as cities all around the world attempt to replicate Silicon Valley at home. So this is a list of various Silicon blank appellations that have existed around the world. I think my favorite is Silicon Welly, which is Wellington in New Zealand. There's also a number of other ones, shipyard, spa, corridor, roundabout. Any feature you can think of, there is a Silicon version of. And so as we get to start thinking, is it true that the economics of the web actually have these local implications? And so that's actually a little abstract. If you're sitting there, you might be like, I have no idea what this guy is talking about, a feeling you may have had elsewhere in this conference. And I think it's actually really important then to actually make this really concrete. So over the next 10 minutes, I'm going to introduce sort of 3 hypotheses that link one fundamental aspect of internet economics to an aspect of urban policy on the ground. And they're effectively provocations to attempt to sort of answer types of certain questions and sort of raise certain types of stories about how things come to be in cities that feature a large internet industry. So the first one I like to call network economics, and it has less to do with the specifics of the internet industry and actually more with industries of a type, most notably the sort of telephone system of the last century. So economists have pointed out, right, and this may be reviewed for some of you, that many assets decline in value as more and more people enter a system, right? So there is a cake. We are trying to share the cake. As more people want the cake, less of us get a piece of it, right? So it tends to decline in value. There's a special class of objects that have this nice feature that as more people join, the value of that network tends to increase, right? Something that Clay Shirky and a number of other people have kind of pointed on. And it's most notable in telephone systems, right? If I can only call one person and that one person can only call me, the network's only so valuable. But as more people join, everybody in a city, everybody in a nation, everybody around the world can contact everybody and they can contact me, that network becomes really strong and really powerful and really valuable. And so that's a feature of the telephone industry, the telecommunications network, but it's also a feature of many of the businesses that exist and dominate the landscape today. So social networks totally benefit from this, right? As more people join, there's more people to meet, more people to socialize with, more people to stay in touch with. And so that's true of Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, you can name all the social platforms. But it's also true of search as well, if you think about it. As more people use search, there's more data to target search, you get better search results. So the asset, again, gains in value as more and more people join it. So what's disturbing about this? Well, economists have pointed out the fact that a lot of industries that feature network effects are natural monopolies, because there's always market forces that make it profitable for you to merge networks together into bigger and bigger agglomerations. So where does that leave us if you're City Hall? Well, City Hall is ultimately confronted then by a small number of extremely large and powerful entities and maybe less able to leverage policy against them than they otherwise would be able to do. So consider for a moment if the internet industry produced lots of small businesses that had differing interests. Right? A single centralized city government may actually be able to regulate them more effectively than a few extremely large players with a lot of leverage. And this may have a lot of implications, for example, for San Francisco's ability to regulate, for example, companies using the public transportation system to bus their own employees from work to the city. So one hypothesis. The second one is one I like calling financing and free, quote unquote. So investing in startups is really hard, right? You invest in young, irresponsible people who often get arrested, Bill Gates. You are investing in technology that has no demonstrated demand. You are really operating out in the open. And most people who start companies actually don't have the capital to go about and pursue these companies on their own. So enter the emergence of the venture capitalists, right? The person who will put the money in and make these sorts of things happen. Now, the venture capitalists, despite kind of all their protestations to a great deal of power, are actually quite limited. They're subject to what's often known as the limited partner, which is the shady guy with a lot more money than the venture capitalists, of which the general partners invest. And so general partners face a great deal of pressure not only to invest in companies that are profitable, but profitable very, 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 very quickly. And so what has been the equilibrium solution that companies have come to? Well, one of them is to offer your services for free and sell advertising against it, right? Indeed, advertising remains the main financial engine for the internet. And so suddenly we're confronted with these two forces, right? Not only are services offered for free, but we have network effects whereby as more people join it, the more valuable this product becomes. So what do you get? You get extremely spiky growth in companies. Companies grow from instantaneously from a small amount of people to a lot of people. And that's an implication for the users on one hand, but more importantly, an implication for the number of employees you need to bring into a company. So this is a quick map, I believe, of Facebook's employment from 2004 to 2014. Anyways, we can start tying this actually to the local kind of urban political landscape, right? So what happens when there's a large influx of people? Well, one of the problems is it's really difficult to design housing policy around these types of economies because there are large influxes of strangers that come in and you may not have capacity to deal with them. But you can't design and build housing for them if you don't know they're going to be there. And since it is unpredictable, you get these large displacement effects whereby large waves of employees come in and they push existing residents out. There's also interesting effects where you can think about the social fabric in which these employees come into a city, right? If an industry grew at a slower rate, they might actually be able to be incorporated into the social fabric in a city in a way that's impossible if you have these huge waves, sort of lightning strikes, come in terms of employment. So let's talk about a final hypothesis, one we can call returns to human capital. So as a point of contrast, think a little bit about the automotive industry of the last century. So automobiles are an interesting product, right, on two respects. One of them is that they're sort of geographically dispersed in their impact, right? You need a lot of components from a lot of different places manufactured to produce cars, right? So the spread, the actual economic activity created by the car can be quite dispersed and quite diverse in a number of different locations and a bunch of different demands. It's also arguably socioeconomically diverse as well, because cars produce a lot of follow-on employment, right? You need not only the investors and capitalists, you also need the designers and engineers, you also need the factory workers, you also need the people who run the fueling stations. There's a continued amount of follow-on employment that's produced by the automobile as a product that an industry produces. Now, of course, I'm not trying to argue here that the automobile is in some way some kind of economic utopia, because obviously it is not. But I think it brings up an interesting point of contrast, which is what is the follow-on employment impact from the internet industry? Well, you need a small number of developers that produce a product that produces huge amounts of value, but many of those services don't produce much follow-on employment. And many people have argued, and some of the audience may argue, well, even if there's a lot of returns to a small number of people, that's okay, because you know what, they're going to buy a lot of stuff. That effect will sort of trickle down to the rest of the economy. But even if you believe this, I think you have to confront the fact, confront the fact that when Instagram was purchased in 2012, this was their entire team, and there was a company that was purchased for $1 billion. And so this has very real and very interesting, I think, inequality effects on an urban space. As these companies come to dominate the industry of a particular city. So 3 hypotheses. What do we learn from all of them? Well, one argument is that these observed phenomena are actually not the effect of local variations, but actually reveal the fundamental economics of the web. That we have structured the internet in such a way that businesses are viable on the internet in a certain way, which produces very real socioeconomic, urban, local effects that we are just now seeing. And indeed, if we want to change those outcomes, we may have to go quite a bit deeper than trying to influence a single company or a single city, and that the relation, the structure of the technology may actually have these very real societal outcomes. So San Francisco, what does San Francisco look like in this respect? Well, San Francisco is ultimately a kind of model species as more and more cities try to adopt the Silicon Valley model. And by studying San Francisco, we actually may be able to learn the ultimate fate of these cities and learn exactly how far we need to go to prevent certain types of outcomes from occurring. And so I'm currently working on an observational study of San Francisco and other cities that are sort of similarly affected or similarly aggressive in New York, trying to build up these economies within their urban spaces. So I know we want to keep it relatively short so we would have discussion. So I want to keep it short. That's all I had. Here's my obligatory contact information. Thank you very much for all your time.
I'm assuming my stuff's on here. Hi everyone. As I figure this out, I'll tell a funny story. I think it's funny. So Tim and I are both from San Francisco or live in San Francisco, and we sort of have similar friends, and we were at a birthday party weekend, how do I do this? I'm not literate in this kind of thing. View, home. So how do I make this full screen? Anyone? Bueller?
Is it slideshow?
Yeah. Where is the view? There we go. No? How do I... Is anyone... I don't know how to use this. I'm sorry. There we go. From beginning. Hey. Hey, guys. The story that I was going to tell, Tim and I were at a party. I thought it'd be really funny if we pretended we had beef. And so when they sent out like the organizing email, I sent like, oh my god, I can't believe I'm on a panel with Tim. This is the worst fucking thing ever. And then I just let it linger, and no one responded, and it was super awkward. So I just sent like a follow-up email a couple days later, being like, guys, just kidding. There's nothing wrong with Tim and I. So I'm Mathias. I'm from Stanford. In the communication department, and I am going to read my first couple slides because I want to like get all the good stuff out of the way, and then I'll sort of shoot from the hip to fill the last however many minutes I have. So the argument that I want to make is I would like for you to look at cities from now on as sort of material precursors for phenomena that we kind of attribute to digital technologies. And as American troops returned from fighting in Europe and Pacific after World War II, American individuals' sense of self from employment, residence, and social affiliations was in a state of flux. For those involved in recreation planning, and this is a recreation center in Eagle Rock, California, the solution to this fluidity was to create neighborhoods around recreation spaces that resembled and embodied and encouraged that same fluidity. Just as recreation spaces would need to remain flexible and adaptable in order to adjust to the changing demands of a neighborhood or community, these spaces would in turn provide social stability through venues in which individuals could rapidly adjust and integrate with any community that they found themselves in. In short, the goals of post-war recreation to produce flexible, mobile, well-adjusted citizens were meant to create a type of American who would think and act like what we would now call networked individuals in a networked society. But another way, the goals of post-war recreation were to create what I call procedural communities. And that's a lot of rhetoric and nomenclature that is sort of specific to communication, and so I'm going to sort of unpack that a little bit and explain why I think this is important. It runs counter to a great deal of the canonical work in communication, which is ostensibly my field. Writers ranging from Howard Rheingold, Mitchell, Castells, Rain, and Wellman have made the case that digital technologies have instituted widespread reorganizations of long-standing notions of community. And what we're seeing here is, if you've read Castells' Network Society, this is Stephen Holt's D.E. Shaw lobby, which he points to as a prime example of what's demanded by what he calls the space of flow. For him, in the network society, we see a decoupling of space and place. For him, a place, I quote, is a locale whose form, function, and meaning are self-contained within the boundaries of physical continuity. Contra this, we have space, and the space of flow is the dominant spatial manifestation of power, and this is a quote again. The space of flows is the dominant spatial manifestation of power and function in our society. For him, the shift from post-industrialism to informationalism that was brought about by network computing technology has manifested itself in a radically new configuration of cities and buildings. The logic of computing has uprooted the city, which is no longer, quote, a place, but a process. He asserts that the value of these processes are derived, quote, not from the cumulative effect, but from the elements present in the milieu, as would have previously been the case in cities, but rather from their interaction. So digital technology, as the story goes, is responsible for creating the conditions for communities that cohere via processes. In other words, for many digital scholars, technology brought about the network society, which for the first time in human history allowed for communities based purely on interest-driven interactions. So what is it that these kind of spaces demand? They demand a kind of individual who's infinitely flexible and adaptable, who sort of can perceive what other people are doing and is coherent in particular modes of interaction. You go onto a website, you kind of understand and you learn and become literate in particular ways of socializing with people. And these are primarily derived from individual interest. So Rainey and Wellman say, moving among relationships and milieus, networked individuals can fashion their own complex identities depending on their passions, beliefs, lifestyles, professional associations, work interests, hobbies, or any number of personal characteristics. And this is the last one I'm going to read, but my arguments, these claims are not new, but rather extensions of collaborations between liberal intellectuals and government officials that, as my advisor Fred Turner has written in his just released book, which everyone should buy because then he gets more famous and then I get more famous and everything's really great. He said, called for individual autonomy within a collaborative, empathetic society and a state that will guarantee both. By creating the material conditions for the process of continual self-making, America's post-war recreation infrastructure was meant to create a type of American exactly in line with what Wellman and Rainey see as being part of the new ICT social order. Whereas scholars such as these trace these shifts to the emergence of computers in the 1960s and 70s, I think these are rooted much more firmly in a shift that occurred right after World War II. And what happened after World War II was, there was a lot of interest in playgrounds. So I do game design, and I was, as you do as a PhD student, sort of stumbling around looking for a topic to write about. And I thought I was really interested in games. And then I started thinking, well, a lot of the literature on games is very presentist. And I wanted to see, like, how how is it that we sort of came to the 1980s and said, oh, games are a really important thing to study, or play with at least, and now we're saying games are a really important thing to study, but we didn't sort of like look at what the precursors to this was. So I'm sort of a cultural historian in some respects. And I stumbled across this in a recreation magazine. And this is, it says, help keep America strong with playgrounds and recreation. And I started getting really into this concept of, well, why is it that recreation is such a big deal in America post-World War II? And in some ways, this is what this talk is about. After World War II, there's a giant movement funded across pretty much every major municipality in America to create recreation centers in which kids could play, adults could play, and learn how to be a type of American. And that's what I'll sort of walk through for the second half of this presentation. So 1948, George Hwang, who's one of the white dudes in this picture, he was the general manager of the newly created Department of Parks and Rec, or Recreation and Parks at that time. And he summarized what his understanding of a shift was he was seeing in recreation across the United States, because there had been recreation prior to this. He said, while early concepts of municipal responsibility in relation to recreation were almost totally in terms of place, his department's role had changed. Now, quote, the function of a municipal department is not solely to acquire, improve, and maintain places of recreation, but to organize the community for better recreation. The place is incidental to the use. So for Hwang, which I probably am butchering, he's been long dead, manager of one of the country's fastest growing cities, leisure places had become secondary to leisure spaces, configurations that, in Castells' telling, helped to organize the time of their communities. So what you're faced with is, cities like that. That's Los Angeles. Post-World War II in Los Angeles, people are just coming to the West Coast in droves. And you're having these new types of communities having to be formed that develop along these kinds of modes of transportation. New modes of, new places for termination and circulation. And this was acknowledged by community planners and city planners as being a very isolating, potentially, phenomenon. So there was this real intellectual movement thinking about how is it that we can create communities in Des Moines, in Houston, in Chicago, in Los Angeles, in San Francisco, in which I, as an American, I'm not an American, but pretend I'm American for a second, I'm Canadian, can move between these places and still be able to integrate myself in a fairly rapid fashion. Americans were moving on average probably every 2 to 3 years in this period, buying new homes in suburbs and then upgrading and moving across town or whatever. And you think about this, it's a very potentially socially disruptive force. You're no longer having a community based on your place, but in fact now you have to go to a new community and reintegrate yourself very quickly so that you can have a productive social life. And the idea behind this was actually it was based on this, the Federal Security Agency in World War II was actually really interested in being able to create neighborhoods in which the moving from the home to the community was seen like a natural thing. So you think now about the 1950s and 40s as being this moment of social isolation. Sort of this is when people start to write about the fact that everyone's sort of in their identical home boxes, sitting at home, watching television in the coming decades. But in fact, there was this real movement to try to get people out of their homes and into their social spaces in the community. And I think I call this talk procedural communities because it's sort of contra Benedict Anderson's notion of imagined communities. These aren't just communities where you're sort of thinking about the other person as being part of your community. These are activity-based interactions where I, as an American, can come to this social space, learn a particular mode of doing something, and through that, use that as a way to reintegrate myself into whatever society I find myself in the following decades when I'm moving across the country rapidly. And so this was a very influential document for city planning called Planning for Recreation Facilities in Small Towns and Cities. And the needs of communities were to be addressed through a hierarchical, interrelated series of spaces in what was termed the neighborhood system. And what they had was it moved from the home to playground to play food to community park or center. The highest level of abstraction in a community park, there was to be a community building. and the building was above else to provide flexibility that accommodated diversity of uses. Quote, the careful arrangement of rooms in the recreation building is important to provide multiple use of all space, easy flow of traffic through the building without congestion or interference with activities, and ease of supervision. So these are sort of the guiding principles for a network model, crude analogy there, of getting people out from their homes into the central space of the community. And in this in the federal security document, they say there's this movement connection between recreation and community. And they say a photography hobby begun in an improvised home darkroom will find satisfying expansion in a neighborhood recreation center. Through organized or individual excursions into natural park areas, the amateur photographer may discover a world of aesthetic satisfaction and a new kinship with the painter, the bird lover, and the gardening enthusiast. So, what do these spaces look like? Well, there's a lot of them. It was based on a very nodal structure, and the important thing here is that the difference between what happened on the home level and what happened in the community level was not of type, but of capacity. So it was the kind of thing where you would learn particular things at home, and you could then, basketball is a sort of prototypical version of this, right? You think about why basketball becomes really important post-World War II, it's because there are basketball courts everywhere. If you see a community center, if you think about where you grew up with a gym, the lines on the floor when you look at a basketball center are in fact extraordinarily political things. They're a way to learn to be an American post-World War II, because I can go and play pickup basketball in my driveway, or I can go down to the rec center and I can learn to integrate myself with this new group of people and have a very low level of social cost associated with that. And when you look at Los Angeles, in fact, the city is derived around recreation centers. Each of these is a recreation center with a sort of smaller recreation center or a park or a parklet sort of associated. And this is about 150 of them were built in Los Angeles, recreation centers were built in Los Angeles post-World War II. Across America, thousands of them were built. And what they are ways for us to move across the country and become a networked individual and fashion our identity in a way that is seemingly very free. You can go in and participate in any number of activities. This is the Eagle Rock Recreation Center. You can play volleyball, you can play basketball. But it's also a very interesting moment because it's also a moment of sort of homogenization of the American landscape. We seem like we have these sort of free association choices, but in fact what happens is you can see this is a very white, very middle-class notion of what sociality is. And I think I'll leave you with this thought of what is the net effect of when you sort of think about this mode of sociality moving up into the contemporary? And when we start to think of digital society as actually being rooted in this kind of notion of mobility and notion of flexibility that's congruous with these spaces, we can start to unravel and see how these are very political choices that get made when we start to design particular modes of interaction on the web, and we start to think about the web as something that is materially rooted like this. I will end there because I'm at time, and I look forward to your comments. Thank you.
How do we do this? So while I'm doing this, just thought I'd say I'm not really an academic. I'm just some dude that's flown to America to tell you about what I think about when I walk home from work. So let's see if that works. Nope. Okay, so I'm going to talk about corporations, kind of infrastructure and politics. I wrote this talk in January when I submitted the abstract, and I thought it would just be a talk of kind of general weak signals, pointing at new things that are kind of on the horizon maybe. But as the months have gone on since I wrote it, like last week there was an article in The Telegraph in the UK, which is Google, the new unelected superstate. which is a really fascinating thing, and kind of the discourse around this is moving a lot quicker than I was expecting. So really the kind of question that I want to ask is, why does this guy get to call this guy about stuff that this guy released, right? Why does Mark Zuckerberg get to call the President of the United States? And I'll come back to that later. Because things are really weird right now. So Bruce Sterling last year coined the term the stacks to describe kind of post-2008 corporations. They're corporations that haven't really existed before. Sorry, I just need to grab my notebook. So Bruce Sterling in this talk at Webstock in 2013 defines the stacks as being huge. They're full of people. They're both employees and also the users of those platforms. They're vertically integrated global software structures that are used by millions. The stacks have new things which corporations haven't really had before. So proprietary OSs, there's the Android phones, there's tablets, and this is something that Benjamin Bratton calls cloud footprint of the stacks. So it's sort of the cloud is now these stacks are putting down footprints. I'm not going to go through them all. Bruce Sterling says that the internet had users and the stacks have livestock. And that they're funded by ads, which depend on knowing a whole lot about you. They have social networks. They're trying to invent their own money. But corporations aren't new. But some of the things that are happening, which kind of are new and are interesting, there's this, which even 3 years ago would have seemed a bit like a dystopian future. This happened 3 years ago, and this is a dystopian future. This is happening. The Facebook were going to buy them, but Google bought them instead. Corporations buying drones, which I'm looking forward to the panel later on about that. Google just bought Nest, which is the thermostat manufacturer, the smart thermostat. This is kind of a deep sensing device which the corporations are now going to be having in your home. Sensing and gathering data, which is interesting because the stacks previously have required you to enter information in so they can monetize you. Whereas now they're putting sensing devices which are kind of autonomous. There's also like the air, there's like an air pollution sensor and other devices like that. On that note, why they made that design decision to make the Nest look like that, I have no idea. So Microsoft has the Kinect, can 3D scan your living room. They can see you in 3D from the when you're on your couch. They're probably not doing it yet, but if they're not profiling you by what type of IKEA couch you have to serve you ads, then there will be soon. Oh, you have the plan. That's $200. Blah 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 blah. And this is one of my favorite Photoshop photos from the last couple of weeks. It's got Snowden as Big Dog instead of the little telepresence robot that he was on. That's such a wicked picture. So this was May 2013. Mackenzie Walk. He wrote this piece in The Guardian where he said Google is becoming the new state, which is really interesting and maybe worrying when you think about it. So there are a couple of examples of kind of corporations acting like states throughout history, but I just want to kind of go through and talk about the similarities between states and corporations. So one of the things that they both share is institutional memory, or corporate memory as it's known in kind of the corporate management sphere. And corporate memory is the way in which an institution passes down tacit knowledge between generations of employees that come and go. So how do you keep a common culture throughout a corporation that's 100 years old, for example, or 50 years old? One of the other things that they do is that they have values. So this is one of the things that Winter was talking about yesterday in the plenary session. Yes, corporations are capitalist, but they have values, and this is how they orient themselves within the business. So ExxonMobil has a mission statement, is committed to being the world's premier petroleum and petrochemical company. As the title of the piece that I pulled this from is a money mission with a profit-centered principles. They also have these values for shareholders, customers, employees, and communities. The environment is strangely absent. So Google, obviously trying to make money, but their mission statement is to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. So this is kind of a driving principle that the way in kind of corporations and within the management theory is if you're going to make a decision, then you can orient around these values to make a decision. So you don't have to ask your boss, for example. You can be like, oh, it meets the mission statement. Let's do it. Which is why Google Streetview cars end up kind of collecting Wi-Fi data and stuff like that, because it kind of suits the value. It fits the mission statement. Facebook's mission is to give the power to share and make the world more open and connected. Did you know Facebook is on Facebook? That's weird, and they haven't done anything since 2012, which is also pretty interesting. Okay, so corporations also, like states, build network diagrams. This is a real company, by the way. What an awesome name. Super Mega Engineers Group. That's Company awesome. Limited organization. So this is an org chart for this company, and it helps them see themselves, and they can kind of define which parts of the corporation do what. Nation states do the same thing with all the different departments, like Homeland Security, blah, blah, blah. Moving on. So I want to talk about digital dualism. If you've got your bingo cards ready, you can take that one off. And I kind of asked the question, like, how do corporations and states see the web? Because the cloud, as a term, as I understand anecdotally from some of the old bearded network engineers that I know from London, the cloud is a term invented by lazy network engineers in the 90s using Microsoft Visio to explain the network. And so we have this kind of conception of the cloud. But what's really interesting is that the discourse around the cloud is changing to become a cloud instead of the cloud. So stored in a cloud, what else is there? Keep the files stored in a cloud, cloud of clouds. That's an interesting one. Unencrypted data that is stored in a cloud. So the kind of discourse around this goes from the cloud as a kind of amorphous shared internet to becoming a cloud and something that is owned. Kind of boundaries and territorialized around the idea that Dropbox has a cloud and this is our part of the internet. This is particularly prevalent in the information security industry, which works with corporations. So they start talking about the cloud and infrastructure as territory, which is where things get really interesting when we talk about corporations and nation states. Because they say you need to secure your territory, and what they mean by that is not only the various Cisco switches and stuff in the data center being their physical property and it's their territory, but they also mean the data that sits on those devices and kind of inside and inside. So from an information security point of view, especially like Bose Hamilton Allen, there was a guy on stage at the QZ conference last year. I was trolling the hashtag, I can't remember when it was, but he talked about territory a lot. And kind of the idea is these people are kind of inside corporations talking about corporations as having territory. The difference between a corporation and a nation state is that nation states see kind of the web as being a landscape as opposed to kind of a physical plot of land that you can own. So in the same way as you have kind of strategies for land, sea and air, war, you now have cyber war, which is I think is a nice subtle difference between kind of corporations saying this is our part of the internet, and when you log into Facebook you're now on our turf, to nation states see it as a landscape that can be operated inside and you can kind of fluidly move between. So this is a picture from MetaHaven, Captures of the Cloud, and it's describing the mega upload takedown using the term super jurisdiction. And in here you've got all the different servers, and it also says about the different laws, as you read through it, all the different laws that we use to kind of take down the company. So this operates across nation states. This is kind of where it's super jurisdiction. So this is across nation states because of the way the infrastructure works. All of these different servers sit on different sovereign territories around the world. So corporations and nation states see the internet in different ways, but the people who are inside these institutions are also individuals, which kind of comes back to a lot of the discourse that cyborgology has done and around digital dualism, because I mean that's a dualist statement right there. This was last week. A German media tycoon was criticizing Google, and you can see here they're talking about operating a legal vacuum without the hassle of antitrust and privacy, a kind of superstate. So again, these people are kind of seeing the stacks as being state-like. Two books that I just want to really recommend is James C. Scott's Seeing Like a State, and he talks about the way states throughout history have made, or they require users to be legible to the state so they can make decisions about laws, and also they also kind of build the landscape in a way to make users or citizens more visible to the state. The other book, Road to Power by Jo Forby, she's a fellow at Harvard, and this is a great book about the history of roads in Britain and kind of the politics and capitalism and the emergence of Enlightenment ideas of the state post Adam Smith. And that's a fascinating book, which I also highly recommend. So on the subject of legibility, this is a census from 1871, name, surname, relation, condition, profession, where you were born, and if you're an imbecile, idiot, or a lunatic in the last comment. So this is from 1871. This is an example of the state of individuals being legible to the state. This is Facebook dossier. This is from a privacy request from 2011, so I expect this is probably a lot longer now. And this is kind of all the information that Facebook has about you in terms of legibility. There's a whole... This isn't new, because there is a whole bunch of stuff that happened around the Western Union telegraph when the telegraph was first invented, and there's a whole bunch of stuff I wanted to say about this, but I really don't have time. But kind of the short story is the British Empire nationalized the telegraph because they had an empire to run, whereas in the US they let different companies operate until they closed the frontier. In 1893, at which point we're out of land, and then value moves up into the telegraph because of the Telegraph Interoperability Act. But yeah, I don't have time to go into that. So in simple critical infrastructure maps, at the top end of those maps we have the nation state. So the nation state requires 5 things in its simplest form: territory, jurisdiction, citizens, international recognition, and effective organisation. There's a whole bunch of internal logic, like a pentagram inside there, to how those relate to each other. And what's really important is when you have a look at these 5 things, if you can swallow the idea that Facebook has territory, then that's why, well, Mark Zuckerberg has 1.2 billion people on his turf. He's got one of, I think it'd be the 3rd biggest nation in the world. You know, that's why, if you can swallow that idea, that's why he gets to call Obama. So the idea of technology as territory is really interesting. So this is a project by Tobias Rebel, who's a critical designer in the UK. And that project is called Design Conflict Territories, and that's it's a Tumblr, and there's also a really good blog post that I recommend you check out. This is the Athens Metropolitan Network, which is a mesh mobile network. It's the biggest in the world. All of the devices that people use are owned by the users, and because it's mesh, there's kind of no corporation running it. And it's a really good example of kind of perhaps a new place of kind of political contestation that we can have in relation to kind of the stacks and the infrastructure. I highly recommend you check that piece out. Lastly, Benjamin Brandt has a book coming out called The Cloud, and I think it's this year or early next year, and I highly recommend that. What he says is happening with corporations, nation states, and infrastructure is the accidental delamination of traditional Westphalian geographies of sovereignty through the realization of other topologies. That's a bit of a mouthful, but hopefully kind of my talk has at least attempted to explain that a little bit. Yeah, thanks. That's it.
I'm just going to start with a question for you, Tim.
Sure.
What I thought was really interesting is just thinking about the idea of the role the city government would play, and how would you maybe walk through what you think. Of course, like there's going to be powerful lobbying from these companies, but maybe like what activism, that role, how that could play in.
Sure, and you mean sort of resisting
Yes.
the efforts of companies to sort of reshape the city. Well, I think some of it in a lot of ways is sort of being done right now. I mean, effective agitprop has been like a very effective strategy, right? So a lot of people pointed out like the barfing on the Google buses, right? Doesn't actually have a lot to do with like what are actually fundamental to the problems in the city, but they have raised a ton of attention. In fact, the fact that we're talking about it right now is like I think a result of like how successful they have been at spreading the message. I think city governments are in a tough spot, particularly because of the budget constraints they face. And there's an interesting question about, so San Francisco, I think, faces this interesting tension where they say, we want to bring in these companies because they're the only section of economic growth we seem to be able to produce. But at the same time, we can't give them the whole pie. And so there's these constant efforts to try to balance the two in ways that lead to a lot of contradictory policy results. And I wonder if the solution is sort of renewed investment in cities from sort of other entities, not just the companies. So if that's a thought, so.
All right, great. Mathias, I was thinking about how, with your talk, I mean, of course, the period of time you're looking at, this is boom years, unemployment's nothing to speak of, workers had some sort of agency and could leave a job, find another one, or at least felt that way. And you start to talk about at the end, like the idea of the inequity, and that we're talking about a very white normative family structure. Like, how maybe you walk through some of those ideas?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the reason why I bring that up is because a similar thing happens. I'm drawing this larger parallel between virtual community research, mostly in the mid-90s, but continues on today. And if you look at the people who were sort of writing about the internet in the very early years, it was a similar group of people, very white, moneyed, generally male individuals. And I guess the argument that I would make is that there's a persistence of that. I mean, it's important to critically interrogate those structures and the sort of positions of the people who are creating those structures. And it's sort of, the infrastructures have a tendency to sort of elide over that because they're there, they confront you as an object. You don't really they don't really reveal the social conditions and the sort of political conditions of the people who were creating those things. So that was sort of the broad thrust of that argument.
Right. Jay, maybe if you could talk about the way that maybe the user can circumvent these new structures, these new ways of organizing through the stacks.
I'm not sure we can, unless I think it's one of those free hardware, free software moments where we're going to need to build new infrastructures. So the mesh network that I mentioned earlier is an interesting one. I think because mesh networks have kind of really interesting properties around property ownership and how states see people owning property. So if it's your Wi-Fi router, which means that you can kind of do whatever you want with it because it's your property, So there's one of the things that Tobias, he's actually just done a film for Lighthouse in Brighton in the UK, and that's called The Monopoly of Legitimate Use, which is kind of like a new, and it kind of, he's talking about that in his movie. Because if it's your device, then you can connect to the mesh network and operate within that outside of a state jurisdiction, as it were.
And I had a question about that actually. So part of the argument is that like these services increasingly resemble states, but I know one of the attributes that you may have left out was sort of states have like a monopoly of force, right? Like they can arrest you, they can put you in jail, they can execute you. Do you think the fact that the stacks are imprisoned sort of within our devices, you know, I guess in some way sort of undermines that argument, right? Like Mark Zuckerberg can't yet call you up and put you in jail, right?
Yeah.
I like the Facebook terms of service. The best they can do is shut off your service.
I think as we move to the future, because the talk was kind of weak signals that I think is going to become more and more interesting. But what happens when we move into kind of the smart city world, where getting disconnected from a stack is really serious, or if you don't accept the EULA to turn on your tap, then you can't drink any water. Mm-hmm. I think that's going to be kind of a new, interesting, a terrible future that we might be living in, because at which point kind of it's the corporations that are physically administering kind of the means of not dying, mm-hmm. which is kind of like what the state traditionally has done.
So you're concerned about like the outsourcing of government services?
Yeah, right? I mean, it all comes down to the social contract in a way as well. Like you won't revolt, or you will obey by these laws, but we'll keep you alive, kind of thing. And I think as kind of that gets outsourced, then corporations increasingly will have control over those things.
Do we have some questions from the audience? Or actually, if you want to line up at the mic, do we have questions on Twitter, Laura?
Do you want to do the hash mod first?
Yeah, do we want to do the hash mod first? Yeah.
No, she's shaking her head.
Okay, let's wait then. All right. Yeah, Kevin, sure.
So thanks for the talks. I noticed that in each of the presentations there appeared sometimes at different levels of focus these official seals, with like American eagles and like names of president whatever's, and like there was the Department of Justice, I think, in your map. It strikes me that is like a very particular kind of artifact of what I would imagine as sort of like an older kind of organization, and it's like a very particular way of communicating like legitimacy and I guess like officialness. And so I guess I would ask is, because I think each of you were sort of looking at like spaces of change in like different spheres, do those seals and do the like sort of things that they imply still have relevance in the areas that you guys are looking at, or are there other sort of like new trappings of officialness that you think take the place of or combat with the seal as we sort of understand it more historically?
I mean, I think what's interesting about the symbology of a lot of these companies is that they try to deliberately create iconography, which is deliberately not state-like, right? So like Google is like, hey, it's like a bunch of multicolored letters, or like Instagram is like a friendly camera with rounded corners, like there's nothing to cut yourself on with it, And maybe this goes to a little bit of Jay's argument, right? Which is like it may be in some ways an attempt to deny that you are a state while you are being a state, right? That you can take on functions of statehood while still giving a presentation that you are nothing more than just a product. I don't know if you guys, I'm just riffing, but.
No, it's really interesting. It brings up, so I mentioned the Keep America Strong Through Recreation thing. And one of the arguments that is sort of underlies a lot of this work that I'm doing is it's really fascinating that this mode of sociality that developed out of public, free, community-driven, whatever, starts to have this elision that ends up in this sort of, it's the same mode of sociality that we see driven by companies currently. And in that same period, 1957, I think, C.D. Jackson, who was Eisenhower's chief psychological warfare officer, speaks to the National Recreation Conference and says, if we win the Cold War, it'll be because we have flexible kids built around recreation. And if we lose the Cold War, well, we'll be able to resist the Russians because we have flexible kids built around recreation. And so you sort of like the movement from that to kind of digital activacy is something that I'm trying to figure out now too. sort of like how does this logical system build in its own modes of resistance almost.
Right. And actually that reminds me too, like it may be interesting too in like the naming of these companies, like the scope of their ambitions. So like I had a conversation with someone fairly recently about like back in the day when they named corporations in America, they really knew how to name them because they were like purely descriptive, right? Like
General, Super Mega Engineer Corp.
Yeah, or yeah, something like that. But like yeah. But like General Electric or like American Telephone and Telegraph, which basically says like this is our industry that we're in. This is just purely descriptive. You could argue that like a new wave of naming, right? Like British Petroleum becoming just BP or like Google or, you know, kind of like names that deliberately have no scope to them is maybe another thing that you can put on it. So
I like that.
I think like the seals, I'm going to compare like states and corporations again. Like the seals are kind of like they are departments of the structure, and that the nation state that which we kind of all like when we understand geopolitics and the nation state is kind of post-Enlightenment Westphalian statehood. So one of the things that's really interesting about kind of the way that they departmentalize parts of the running of countries is the way that power shifts in the Enlightenment from kind of democracy happens, and then corporations are still just feudal, straight up and down power structures, and then they split them out by giving them seals. So to your kind of like your last bit is, I think what's really interesting is perhaps to watch what's happening in the kind of horizontal flat corporation space, where small companies are operating on a very like low hierarchy. And I mean, there are some really big companies, like the Mondragon Corporation in Spain. It's the biggest workers-owned co-op in the world, and it has like, I think it's $1 billion of revenue. And that's it's all kind of nested committees as opposed to being, I think that's interesting. We should keep an eye out for that.
Yeah, I'll shut up after this too, but have you seen the GitHub offices at all?
They're crazy.
So this might be interesting. So the GitHub offices, which has been in the news recently, has within it, in its lobby, a Oval Office. Mm-hmm. And there's a replica of the Situation Room actually within the office too. But
wow,
just to toss that your direction.
And the rug.
Also the rug, yeah, which was of some contribution. So, sorry.
So my question's for Tim.
Sure.
So you talked about how we see these things in San Francisco, like income inequality and intense gentrification that are the result not so much of any particular company or policy, but the internet industry itself. And you talked about how understanding the way that industry is structured can guide our thinking about how we influence those urban outcomes. So I'm curious about places like Chicago or Detroit that are, trying to build an economy on high technology and kind of mock out the Silicon Valley economy, but that have this industrial heritage. Mm-hmm. And I wonder how that changes the way we think about influencing those outcomes. Like, how does having to take that, the remains of that industrial economy into account, does that change, the way we think about those things?
Yeah, I hadn't thought about it, but I think that's definitely right. Like, I don't want to make the argument that, like the internet economy is like this, like, magical force that, like, structures cities in a certain way, right? Like, humans matter, norms matter, and history totally matters, right? And so, like, the idea is not necessarily to say that, like, individual companies and individual cities won't have a word to say in how this happens. It was just that there may be another force that we're ignoring. I think it's really interesting to maybe argue that, like, a history of, like, industrial organization, particularly about the social networks that are created around that. I mean, like, social groups that are created around that. I'm thinking about, like, the force of unions and the tradition of unions and all that other stuff might influence, like, the types of products that are produced, but also how that labor is organized. Yeah, I think it'd be really interesting. I think it's really ripe for research. I hadn't considered it, but I could totally see that for sure.
You see some of it playing out in Oakland. I mean, Oakland was organized around military predominantly, but there's a huge manufacturing sector in Oakland.
That's right. Yeah.
Traditionally.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's interesting that there's sort of this weird thing happening in Oakland. Both part up. I mean, Facebook has shuttles going from Oakland too.
Right.
So.
And I guess it has a lot to do with how you structure your replication of Silicon Valley as well, right? So a lot of people say, like, we need talented developers, get them everywhere you can, just bring them in, right? So you get those weird migration patterns that cause. But I mean, Oakland, for example, has been a lot more aggressive, and there's a number of investors in that city that say, like, we only want to give to companies that will hire locally, right? And I think, like, movements like that may actually change some of the outcomes, for sure. But, like, it's almost like they have to give up, like, a quick profitability in order to do so, so there's always this kind of countervailing force. Yeah. So, yeah.
Hi, my name is Lauren. I was the hashtag moderator for this panel, so I just thought I'd give a quick update from the interwebs. There was a lot of great discussion on the hashtag, so people can check it out. There weren't any questions, or there aren't so far, that were specifically asked about the panel. But there was a comment that I thought I might turn into a question. So, specifically for Mathias, but probably for Tim as well, or if any of you want to comment on it. When we were talking about the digital technology being responsible for communities that are based on interest-driven interaction, there was a comment from the audience that it was an interesting thing to think about the gentrification while sitting in a warehouse in Williamsburg. So spaces like this, this is kind of building, again, on the last question, so this might just be a continuation of that conversation.
Actually here, like this
yeah,
building.
So how do spaces like this function in that way?
Yeah, no, that's super interesting, because I think it's an extension, right? What I'm fascinated by is the sorts of things that cohere, the processes that cohere communities together, and this is certainly one of them. And I would say that, we were talking a little bit about race and gender earlier. I don't think at all we've moved past the sort of white male version of the internet. I mean, I'm very self-reflexive about this, but you can take a look around the audience, and sort of this is a white male audience predominantly. And that has all sorts of implications, and this is sort of an open, flexible space. So it's a lot of recurring patterns yeah, I don't know what else.
That's what we were saying before about naming, that comes into that issue as well, like the idea that anonymity was so valuable to communities that might not want expectations of them placed upon them.
Right.
And yes, the visibility of these, or the needing to.
Yeah. And this is a process that coheres us. I mean, we're forging a community in this sort of conversation space. And I think you see the rise of conferences such as these. Those are starting to be also convened by companies. So if you look at like TED and the Wall Street Journal, All Things D conferences, these are all sort of processes as well that cohere certain groups together in particular ways and has particular power implications and economic implications. And
yeah, I mean, I think there's two possible ways of cutting at the comment, right? Like one of them is like by industry, right? So like I heard interesting theory about New York, which is like it already has a great incumbent industry of like finance and media, right? And so there's this interesting battle where technology industry coming in has to basically contend with these huge industries that already suck up a lot of resources and have a lot of influence in the city. And so the effect on urban spaces actually might be moderated by the existence, for better or for worse, of like the industries that are already in the space. And so like Williamsburg may, cool. For better, yeah, right. So the development of Williamsburg is this like bizarre amalgam, right, where like there's a technology industry that's trying to come up, but it's also in competition with like these existing forces. I forgot the second point, but that was the first point.
Second point wasn't as good. So.
Yeah. No.
Next question.
Yeah, so I guess I kind of have a general question about scale in relation to all three presentations. In a sense, I'm wondering if a lot of the consequences of what you're describing is kind of affected the particular architectures or corporations or industries you're describing, or whether they're simply kind of symptoms of broader kind of expressions of political economy, or a certain kind of neoliberal moment, financial capital, all these kinds of things which seem to be really imbricated in kind of all of these phenomena, less so about a certain kind of technology, but more about a general kind of social relation. I was wondering if you could elaborate on that.
I mean, I can spot, but you have. So yeah. What that made me think of is, so the reason why I'm interested in turning back to the 1950s is that what I think it's really important to start thinking about what happens when companies like Facebook indoctrinate a particular mode of sociality across all sorts of cultures that might not sort of have arisen, and cultures that have arisen in other social political moments other than ours. And so exactly to that point, the technologies that we're using are derived, I think, from a very heavily West Coast, white male notion of what it is to be a networked person in the world. The types of friendships that cascade from that, the types of family interactions you have. And it's this very weird, I use soft imperialism very softly, but it's this very interesting thing that, and I don't think we've thought a lot about it, but what happens when we're now sort of putting this mode of sociality that isn't from this neoliberal moment into places that sort of are organized otherwise?
I'm going to go the other way and talk about the past. So if we think about kind of infrastructure as a technology, I mean, including the web, but ultimately infrastructure is and cities is what keeps us alive. It's why we built them. And I think that's really important to kind of remember. And one of the themes I think that's sprung up throughout the whole conference is the way that technologies kind of internalize ideologies, and that they are biased in certain ways by the way that they're built. So kind of the roads in Jo's book, she talks about how roads were never built internally within nation states until kind of the 17th century. And that is and the reason why they built roads is because capitalism. They wanted to freedom of movement of goods. There's also, I mean, you can look at all the different kind of technologies that we use in that way. Like water grids are very Victorian in terms of command and control. And then kind of as we go through, I think it's kind of important that we're kind of exporting new technologies to other places, but we are also kind of affected by historical decisions that were made in our infrastructure and how it works.
Right. I almost detect like there's sort of like the classic social sciences game at work in your question and comment, right? It's like, does ideology cause infrastructure, or does infrastructure cause ideology? And I don't know, like, so as like a point of discussion, right, it's like, where does tech libertarianism come from, right? Like, so you could argue, for example, that like, oh, in order to build these super risky technologies, you have to have like this messianic belief in yourself. And so like libertarianism just kind of arises as a result of like, you have to deal with the risks inherent in doing these types of startups. And then the other approach is like, oh, there's a particular confluence of forces that led people to produce these like libertarian technologies that like enforce this ideology on everybody. As I guess the past century of discussion on that topic has revealed, there's no particular answer, but I guess as a way of thinking about it. So.
Hello, I'm Willow. Guys, I'm really glad to hear the historical take on recreational spaces, because it smacks nearly exactly of the debate in makerspaces over whether or not to take DARPA funding. I like how your talks all reflect each other on the continuum of how our communities build and how they influence our cities and infrastructure and how all of that was connected. I would really like to know about the intervention points that you see. I have a much better understanding of the connection now, but now I want to see how to fix shit.
I'm in academia. Purely descriptive.
Sure. So I'm concerned, right? Because the implication of the talk that I just gave was that like these outcomes that you see in cities are actually a result of like the structure of the web. So like the interventions actually come from like trying to design a technological structure that produces certain types of businesses that produce certain types of social results. The line between those three things I think is really difficult to map. But I guess that's a level of intervention I guess I would think about, right? I guess it's arguably a little bit technologically determinist, right? Because the argument is that like the structure of the technology is causing cities to be this way. But I think in a lot of respects, like the design of certain types of tools can be really helpful. But ultimately, I don't know, I work on a project called the Awesome Foundation, which is like, it's basically just small groups of people getting together to just like give money away to awesome projects. I believe a lot in like just kind of like the local organization of people around these sorts of issues. Because I think when cities become more aware that this is happening, they can certainly mitigate the problems, if not solve them. So.
I will say from the historical perspective, I mean, basketball is really important post-war America, but then if you look at so the Watts riots in Los Angeles started a recreation center. Basketball is now an extraordinarily black male pursuit when it was sort of conceived of as a white male pursuit. Don't know what that lineage is, and I'd be interested to learn more about it, but I think I think the systems that we work in do have these touch points. For the life of me, don't know where they are though. Sorry.
I'm gonna maybe pick up on kind of some of the things that my accelerationist comrades from back in the UK have said, and about kind of infrastructure and technology as being a trap, and maybe we should go right back to kind of look at fundamental technologies in the kind of open source movement. Again, I was talking about this earlier, but like, can we give everybody in the world, 7 billion people, a water purifier and a way of going to the toilet without getting germs? You know, can we remove ourselves from kind of this sedentary infrastructure trap that we've built for ourselves over the last kind of 9,000 years, from the invention of agriculture onwards? And I think that's a really interesting thing. And I mean, it might sound a bit like a crazy kind of eco-libertarian opinion, but I'd certainly be interested in kind of all of those new technologies, kind of appropriate technologies which are being deployed to various parts of the world.
Yeah, one thought too is I wonder whether or not you can target engines of your enemies, right? So the idea is advertising drives much of the web industry. So can you find a way to make advertising work less well or slow it down over time? And I mean, there's evidence to suggest that like at least a big portion of ads, right, like display and search ads are becoming less effective over time. But I wonder if there's ways of accelerating that, right? Like finding ways to like figure out where your enemy is drawing its financial resources and then just like bleeding it out in some way. So does that mean a radical form of ad blocking? I have no idea.
Or,
but, you know,
do you build a better version of AdWords and it's open source?
Sure, yeah, right. I mean, I think there's a lot of approaches to the problem, but yeah, to make it more aggressive, I think maybe it's just like, look at where the money comes from and kill it. So
we have time for one more
One
question.
last question.
So, which is great, because we have one question and we have time for one last.
I say this with the fear of being run out of this conference on a rail, but as an unrepentant digital dualist, it seems to me that digital monism is in many ways an ideological prop for some of the dark sides of this expansion of the technology corporate infrastructure. I mean, it's how convenient if you think that all reality is continuous across the virtual divide, right? Or there is no virtual divide. Then you can justify integrating in any part of your life or nation. So I mean, any comments on digital monism as an ideological enabler of some of these the darker parts of this?
I think that's a really interesting question, because especially when you look at infrastructure and how giant corporations or like the stacks work, is they have servers all over the world. So there really is a kind of real question around sovereignty of those things, because the web is kind of a transnational or transglobal entity, but when you talk about server farms, they sit in different, that was the super jurisdiction that they were talking about before. I think it's a really complicated question, because nation states kind of interact with, they won the battle against the church like way back, and they understand value as being land, whereas the stacks kind of see information as being like informational value, which I guess is what the church saw like back in the day. And I think there's so much that I want to just like, but yeah, it's a really hard question. That's how we're gonna end. Yeah.
Do either of you have any?
Yeah, I guess one thought. So have you seen Eben Moglen speak at all? So he's this professor. He's this wacky guy up in Columbia, right? Columbia, Eben Moglen. Anyways, sure. He gives these very like polemical speeches. And he always refers bizarrely to Mark Zuckerberg as this like vampire type character. And like everybody in the audience is always confused when he brings this up, but he just goes for it. He just doubles down on that metaphor. And the general point is like, oh, Mark Zuckerberg like promised you like infinite life and infinite beauty, but like he's actually evil. It's a little bit overwrought. But like, I mean, the general intuition of it I think is kind of right, which is like that we may have already crossed the point of no return. And so it may be difficult, like I would be concerned about maintaining a position of digital dualism insofar as it blinds us from a reality that we seem to be facing, right? That like even if you want to opt out, you are still in some ways opted in. There's a really long discussion in response to that for sure, but I guess that's a thought that I have, yeah?
Well, thanks guys.
Thank
This
you.
was really great.
Thanks.